I never thought the sound of silence could weigh so heavily on a man's shoulders. But for the past several years, it has been the only true companion left to me. Mornings come quietly in my small one-story house in West Fargo, North Dakota, and the walls echo not with laughter or conversation, but only with the faint tick of the old wedding clock that has hung in my kitchen since 1968. My name is Oberon Hollis. I am 78 years old and I live alone. I was not always alone, of course. For 42 years, I had the steady presence of my wife, Lavinia, who seemed to carry light into every room she entered, and for a time we both believed that our daughter, Beatrice, and later our grandchildren, would be that same light in the twilight years of our lives. But life is a cruel editor. It erases people from photographs, dulls the voices of those we once heard daily, and leaves us standing in kitchens with coffee cups in our hands, wondering what exactly went wrong and when. The hook of my story is simple, but devastating. I gave my daughter and her husband $50,000, not a loan, not a gift without conditions, but an investment into what I thought was going to be a family home that would bind us together, a gesture of trust and belonging, the sort of act a father makes when he wants his daughter to know she will never be without him. And yet, when I finally crossed the threshold of that house, months later, heart heavy with longing just to see where my money and my love had gone, my daughter looked me square in the eye and said, "This is not your house." Words can burn more deeply than fire, and I swear to you that in that moment, though my body still drew breath, something inside me turned to ash. I had not yet pulled out the papers, those crumpled documents I had signed without reading carefully, the ones that would later reveal the shocking truth about what I truly owned. But already I knew I had been pushed outside the circle of my own blood. Let me step back for a moment, because a confession, to be understood, must unfold in its own time. And perhaps if you see the mornings and the evenings as I lived them, you will better understand how such a betrayal could take root. My mornings still begin with coffee, though it is a poor imitation of the way Lavinia used to make it. She had a small ritual: 3 tablespoons of ground beans, 200 milliliters of water, and oddly enough, a pinch of salt to draw out the bitterness. It sounds strange, but her coffee always had a warmth that no cafe or machine has ever matched. When she died suddenly of a stroke, just a year after I retired from my 45-year career as an accountant, the ritual fell to me. I measure the grounds with hands that sometimes tremble, add the water too quickly, forget the salt until the cup is already cooling, and end up with something that tastes like regret more than coffee. Yet I still do it, because in those few minutes I feel her standing behind me, perhaps amused at how clumsy I am, perhaps sad at how stubbornly I refuse to let her recipe die with her. That small act each morning is a conversation with a ghost. Beatrice, our only child, did not come to her mother's funeral. That fact alone should tell you much about the woman she became, though if you had met her at 20, you would not have believed she could harden so completely. She claimed she had an unavoidable business meeting in Chicago and flew in 3 days after the neighbors and I had already buried the love of my life. She gave me a dry hug, looked around the house as though she were appraising it for resale, and asked if I was planning to sell it. "It's too big for one person," she said. "Besides, you're not young anymore. Maybe you should think about a nursing home." Her words struck like blows to a man already raw with grief. But she did not flinch. Lavinia always defended her daughter as practical. I always thought of her as calculating, and that day I said it aloud for the first time. My daughter looked at me with disgust, as if I had violated some sacred code. She did not stay the night, preferring a hotel, and within hours of arriving, she was gone again. I would not see her for almost a year after that. So it was that my evenings, once filled with shared dinners, conversations about our grandkids, and small rituals of family, became long stretches of silence, interrupted only by the hiss of the kettle or the scratching of my pen against the crossword puzzle. There is a cruel truth about grief. It does not just take the person you loved, it rearranges the loyalties of those who remain. Beatrice, who once leaned on her mother for every decision, now treated me as if I were nothing more than an aging checkbook. When she called, it was to ask for money. First, for the twins' tuition, then for repairs to her house, then for a new car for Thornton, her husband. She rarely asked how I was feeling, never asked what my days were like, and when I offered help that wasn't financial, she dismissed me with impatience. Yet I never said no. Part of it was that I had the money. Lavinia and I had always been frugal, and between her insurance policy and my savings, I had more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my days. But a larger part of it was something harder to admit. I gave because giving was the only way left to feel connected to her. Each check I signed was a desperate attempt to buy a place in her life, even if all it bought me was a cold, "Thanks, Dad." 8 months before everything came to a head, she and Thornton bought a house in a better neighborhood. They came to me, all sweetness and light, asking if I could help with the down payment. $50,000, they said, would make the difference. Beatrice promised that my name would be on the papers, that I would be a co-borrower, that it would make the bank happier, and that it would be your house too, Dad. You can visit any time. How could I say no to words like that? In my loneliness, the idea of having a second home where I was welcome, where I could hear the sound of family again, was intoxicating. I went to the lawyer's office, signed every document without reading, and left feeling lighter, almost hopeful. Thornton looked at me that day with the unease of a man who had gotten more than he expected. If I had been wiser, I would have read that look as a warning. Since then, however, the silence deepened. My calls went unanswered, my messages ignored. Beatrice, when she did pick up, spoke in clipped tones and hung up quickly. I had never set foot inside the house I had helped purchase. My $50,000 had bought me nothing but thicker walls between us. Yet I clung to the hope that one day she would surprise me, that she would call without needing something, that she would remember that before she was a businesswoman or a mother or a wife, she was my daughter. When she finally did call with an invitation, my heart leapt like a boy's. But that is for later. For now, understand only this. I am a man who gave everything, money, loyalty, time, and patience, to a child I raised with love, only to discover that love can be rewritten, erased, and even sold for less than the price of a car. And yet, in ways she never imagined, I still had a card left to play. The day the phone rang, and I heard my daughter's voice unprompted for the first time in years, was the day something inside me stirred awake. Something between cautious hope and the instinctive suspicion that had been honed by too many cold encounters with her. She said, almost cheerfully, "Dad, Thornton and I are going to the coast next month, 2 weeks in Maine. We thought you might like to join us." Her tone was light, a little forced perhaps, but after years of being treated as an afterthought or worse, the idea that she wanted my company sounded like a miracle. I sat with the receiver pressed against my ear, heart thudding in a way that embarrassed me, and tried to process what she had just said. For 5 years she had ignored me, called only to request money, made excuses when I asked about the grandchildren. But now she was inviting me on a family trip. I asked her to repeat it, half certain I had misheard, but she only sighed, a trace of impatience slipping into her voice, and said yes. A cottage near Kennebunkport, 3 bedrooms, ocean view, Thornton says the fishing is wonderful." The irony of her mentioning fishing did not escape me. She knew full well that I had sold all the fishing gear after Lavinia's death, because fishing had been her passion, not mine. Still, I swallowed the bitterness that rose in my throat and said it sounded wonderful. I could not bring myself to ask why she had suddenly remembered I existed, though the question circled in my chest like a trapped bird. After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table with the phone still in my hand and the taste of cold coffee on my tongue. The house was as silent as always, but for the first time in years I felt a pulse of something that might have been excitement. Perhaps this was her attempt to repair what had been broken. Perhaps she had finally realized how much distance she had put between us. I told myself to stop being suspicious, to accept the gesture at face value, because even a starving man does not ask too many questions when someone finally offers him bread. And yet, deep down, another part of me whispered that nothing with Beatrice was ever simple, that every gift she gave came tied with a string that would eventually cut into my skin. Still, I said yes. I began to plan what to pack, check my passport, put my medications in order, even counted out $1,000 in cash just in case, telling myself that it was simply an old man's precaution, not a lack of trust. But in truth, I did not trust them, not entirely. I wanted so badly to believe this was about family, yet some shadow in me kept whispering that it was about something else entirely. The weeks leading up to the trip passed in a haze of preparation and nervous anticipation. I told myself stories while shaving in the morning about how perhaps this would be the summer when I was welcomed back into their lives, when I would finally hear my grandchildren laugh again, when Thornton might treat me like something more than an inconvenient appendage to his wife's past. I even imagined evenings by the sea, conversations over dinner, long walks where Beatrice might finally open up to me the way she used to as a girl, when she would put her small hand in mine and ask impossible questions about the stars. Those dreams warmed me against the loneliness of my house, but they also made the silence deeper when reality reasserted itself. I did not tell anyone about the trip. I wanted it to be mine, a secret possibility of happiness, not something mocked or doubted by neighbors who had long since seen how my daughter treated me. When the day finally came, I was ready 2 hours before they arrived, my suitcase packed neatly by the door, my documents in order, my heart racing like it used to before an exam or a first date. They were late, of course. Beatrice swept into the house with the cool confidence of someone inspecting a property rather than greeting her father, and Thornton did not even get out of the car. I should have known then. She looked at my clothes with disdain, made a cutting remark about my trousers, and whisked my suitcase out the door before I could protest. Thornton sat behind the wheel tapping his fingers, not even bothering to acknowledge me properly when I climbed into the back seat. The air between them was charged, brittle, and though I tried to make conversation, every word seemed to irritate them. At lunch, they mocked me, invented stories of clumsiness I knew had never happened, corrected my order with the waiter as though I were a child, incapable of making choices. A slow humiliation began to seep into the trip, drip by drip, until by the time we reached the coast, I felt more like a burden they had reluctantly agreed to drag along than a father they had invited with love. The cottage was beautiful, but I was given the smallest room, a narrow bed, and a view of a garage wall instead of the ocean. They left me alone most of the time while they toured wineries, sailed, played golf, living the vacation I had thought would be shared. My presence was reduced to a prop, someone to photograph and send to the twins with captions about how well we're taking care of Grandpa. And when I protested, when I said I wanted to join them, they told me gently but firmly that the activities were too much for me, that my medication would not allow it, that my health was fragile. They spoke as if I were not sitting right there, as if I were an object that had to be managed rather than a man who could think and feel. I began to realize that the invitation had never been about including me, but about using me, though at that time I still could not imagine the full extent of their plan. The breaking point came not with shouting or confrontation, but with silence. One morning I awoke to an empty house, a note on the kitchen table saying they had gone on a trip to another town, sandwiches in the fridge for me, and an emptiness that felt intentional. Something was wrong. My wallet had been rifled through in the night, my credit card missing, my passport no longer where I had left it. The truth struck me with the clarity of a blade. They had not invited me to Maine to draw me closer, but to leave me stranded, to strip me of identity and resources, to make me appear confused and incapable, to build a case that I was no longer fit to live on my own. Suddenly, the weeks of small humiliations, the lies about my health, the fabricated stories of forgetfulness, all came together into a single, chilling picture. They were preparing to erase me, not just from their lives, but from my own, by painting me as incompetent. My own daughter was conspiring to take away the last dignity I had left, my independence, my control over my own life. The trip was never about family. It was about erasure. That was the catalyst. The moment the silence of my house in North Dakota transformed from loneliness into a weapon sharpened against me. The moment I realized I was not merely unwanted, but in danger of being disposed of. It was not the loss of money that cut me deepest, though the $50,000 burned in my memory. It was the realization that my daughter, the girl I had once carried on my shoulders, the girl who had drawn pictures for me and begged me to read bedtime stories, now saw me as an obstacle to her comfort, a signature to be forged, a voice to be silenced. Betrayal on that scale does not erupt in an instant. It builds slowly, through years of small rejections, until one morning you find your passport hidden under shirts not by accident, but by design, and you know you have been written out of your own life. That realization was the spark that lit the fire of everything that came after. I sat with that note in my hands for a long time, the carefully written words in my daughter's precise handwriting seeming to vibrate on the page, as though they had been designed not merely to inform me of her absence, but to confirm my irrelevance. Daddy Thornton and I went on a field trip to a neighboring town. We'll be back late tonight. There are sandwiches in the refrigerator. Don't miss us. B. That was all. No warmth, no apology, not even the perfunctory affection of a signature that included the word love. Just a practical, dismissive instruction, as though I were a tenant left behind in their rental property or a doddering dependent to be pacified with leftovers. For a moment I tried to tell myself that perhaps I was being overly sensitive, that maybe they had genuinely planned an outing that could not include me. But the truth was already gnawing at the inside of my chest like a rat that had finally chewed through its cage. I went to the refrigerator, opened the door, and saw the sandwiches she had left, wrapped neatly in plastic, and the sight filled me with more dread than comfort, because it confirmed that my role in this carefully orchestrated vacation was not as a companion, but as a dependent who needed to be managed, someone for whom meals must be prepared in advance, lest he forget to eat. And then I checked my wallet, already uneasy after the strange feeling I'd had when I awoke, and found the credit card missing. The small bundle of cash I had hidden was still there, but the card was gone, and the passport that I had kept in the side pocket of my suitcase had been moved, tucked beneath a stack of shirts as though someone had placed it there deliberately, as though someone had wanted me to believe I had misplaced it myself. That was the moment when the fog cleared and the shape of the trap became visible. Everything that had happened over the last several days, The mockery at the restaurant, the invented stories about my forgetfulness, the condescending reminders about medication, the deliberate exclusion from outings, suddenly aligned in a single, coherent picture. They had not brought me here to share time as a family. They had brought me here to demonstrate incompetence, to build a case, to strip me of dignity and present me to the world as a confused, senile man who could not be trusted with his own affairs. And by leaving me alone, without money or documents, in a town far from home, they had begun the process of erasing me. It was a peculiar kind of murder, not of the body, but of the mind and the identity. To strip a man of his papers, his financial tools, his autonomy, and to surround him with stories that painted him as unreliable, was to kill him while leaving him alive. My own daughter, the child for whom I had worked 45 years, the child whose education I had funded, whose tears I had dried, whose every request I had answered, was now attempting to erase me from existence in order to gain access to what little remained of my life's labor. I remember sitting on the narrow bed in that small room with its view of a neighbor's garage, staring at the passport, the missing credit card, and the note, and feeling a strange mixture of panic and clarity. Panic because I was far from home with no immediate way of contacting anyone I trusted. Clarity because in that moment there was no more room for denial or hope. My daughter did not love me, not even in the minimal way one expects family to love. She saw me as an obstacle, as an inconvenient old man whose property and savings could be harvested once he was officially declared incompetent. I thought of the lawyer back in West Fargo, the day we signed the mortgage papers, the way he had asked if I was sure I wanted to be a co-borrower, the way Thornton had looked at me nervously across the table, and I realized that perhaps in my grief, in my loneliness, I had signed not just papers, but the opening scene of a plan they had been drafting for months. They had given me a role in their story, the failing father who could no longer handle his own affairs, whose decline would justify their takeover of his property. And I had walked into that role with open eyes clouded by the desperate wish to be wanted. It is strange how humiliation gathers its power not from the grand betrayals, but from the small ones. At the restaurant in Minneapolis, they had laughed about an incident that never happened, describing how I spilled pasta on myself and how embarrassed they were. At the cottage, they had insisted I could not go on excursions, using words like fragile, medication, memory, as though repeating them often enough would make them true. They had insisted on ordering food for me, insisted on controlling my choices, and each time I told myself it was nothing, that perhaps they were only being cautious, that I should not overreact. But when I discovered the card gone, the passport moved, the note written with such studied detachment, every humiliation, every condescension, every dismissal fell into place like stones in a wall. The wall was a prison built around me, and they had intended for me to remain inside until the world believed what they were telling it, that I was incapable of caring for myself, that guardianship was necessary, that my accounts and my property should be managed by them. That realization did not come with rage, not immediately. Instead, it came with a cold, almost professional detachment. The way I used to feel as an accountant when I balanced a set of numbers and saw the discrepancy staring at me from the page. The discrepancy was that the daughter I thought I had was no longer the daughter standing before me. Beatrice had turned into someone else, someone for whom family was a ledger and love was a liability. Thornton, of course, had always been an opportunist, but to see my own blood following his lead was a revelation I was not prepared for. Sitting there in that narrow room, I decided that if they were building a case against me, I would have to build one of my own. Not a case in court at first, but a case of survival, a case of resistance, a refusal to be erased. I counted my cash again, checked my license, thought through routes back to town, and realized that while they had stripped me of much, they had not stripped me of everything. I still had my wits, and as long as I had those, the plan to erase me would fail. But before I could leave, before I could act, I sat for hours replaying every moment of the past years, trying to understand how it had come to this. I remembered Beatrice as a little girl, how she would crawl into bed between Lavinia and me during thunderstorms, clutching my hand so tightly I thought my fingers would break. I remembered her teenage years, her laughter, her occasional defiance, her long conversations with her mother. I remembered her wedding day, the way she looked nervous yet radiant, the way Lavinia had whispered to me that she was worried about Thornton, but did not want to spoil the moment. And I remembered the day she had asked me for the $50,000, her face soft, almost affectionate, her promise that the house would be mine too, that I would always be welcome. Each memory felt like a lie now, or worse, like evidence in a trial where I had been the defendant without knowing it. She had built a story in which I was disposable, and I had believed the opposite. The weight of that miscalculation pressed on me with a force almost unbearable, but beneath it grew something harder, colder, something I had not felt in years. Resolve. That night, lying awake in that narrow bed, I understood that my days of passivity were over. The man who had signed checks out of guilt, who had handed over money to buy proximity to his daughter, who had ignored slights in order to keep the door open, was dead. In his place was a man who would not allow his life to be rewritten by lies. I did not know yet how I would return to Fargo, how I would protect what was mine, how I would prove my competence when my own family was trying to paint me as senile. But I knew that the first escalation had already occurred, that the battle had begun the moment they slipped my credit card from my wallet and smiled at me across the dinner table as though I were a child. They thought they had humiliated me into submission, but all they had done was awaken the part of me that still understood numbers, contracts, and the cold clarity of truth. The trap had been set, but I would not be the one caught in it. I left the cottage that morning with the clear intention of never coming back to it in the same way, because to remain inside those walls was to remain inside the cage they had designed for me. And though my body was slower than it had once been, my mind was still sharp enough to know that cages must be fled before the door shuts entirely. The street outside was bright with the salt smell of the ocean and the cries of gulls, but to me it felt like the backdrop of an escape, the kind of journey a fugitive makes when he knows that if he delays even an hour, he may never have another chance. I walked toward town with $1,000 pressed close to my chest, counting each step as if distance itself could save me from their plans. And with each block that fell behind me, the fog in my head thinned and the air seemed to sharpen. By the time I reached the bus station, I was no longer a father waiting for his daughter's kindness. I was a man preparing for a kind of war that would not use weapons but documents, signatures, and the resilience of memory. It was at the station that I first tasted the full extent of the betrayal. I approached the counter with my wallet in my hand, ready to buy a bus ticket to Portland so I could make my way home to Fargo. And when the clerk asked for identification, my fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second. My passport was gone, hidden by Beatrice in a neat little arrangement of shirts, as though she were a nurse setting up a hospital bed. And I had almost forgotten I still carried my driver's license, tucked away because I had long since stopped driving. Pulling it out, seeing the photo of a younger man with a clearer gaze, I realized how precarious my situation had been. If not for that piece of plastic, I might have been stranded completely, declared a confused old man who had lost his way. I bought the ticket, my hands shaking slightly, and as I sat on the bench waiting for the bus, I saw my own reflection in the glass of the station window, and for a moment I hardly recognized myself. There was no grief-stricken widower in that reflection, no ATM father dispensing money. There was only a man stripped bare, forced to see his life through the eyes of those who had chosen to exploit him. The bus ride to Portland stretched on endlessly, not because of its length, but because of the thoughts that hammered at me with every mile. I thought about the ATM withdrawal that would surely show up on my account, the forged story they would tell the bank about a lost card, the inevitable phone calls I would receive that would sound worried, but be crafted to build a narrative of senility. I thought of the cottage with its sandwiches in the fridge, not as a vacation home, but as a holding pen where they could polish the image of a father slipping away, a man who forgot things, who left stoves on, who ordered the wrong food at restaurants. Every lie they told at dinner, every condescending pat on the hand, every sideways glance at Thornton's smirk had been evidence-gathering, rehearsals for a courtroom where I would not even be allowed to speak for myself. And as the miles passed and the sea gave way to highways and gray towns, my fear hardened into something else, something I had not felt in years, resolve mixed with rage. I would not let them win. I would not vanish quietly into the shadow they had chosen for me. Arriving in Portland and discovering the cost of airfare almost broke me. $800 for a single ticket to Minneapolis. And even if I managed to pay it, I would have been left with almost nothing for the rest of the journey. I stood at the counter, staring at the numbers on the screen, feeling the edges of despair gnaw at me, when an older woman in a uniform came over and asked if I needed help. There was no judgment in her eyes, only concern, and I realized how long it had been since a stranger had spoken to me without calculation. She suggested the bus option, a long and grueling 3-day ride, but affordable, and in that moment I knew it was the only path left to me. I bought the ticket and sat in the cafeteria waiting for departure, drinking lukewarm coffee and staring at my trembling hands. The humiliation of what had happened in Maine, the theft of my card, the manipulation of my image, the sheer audacity of my daughter's plan to render me incompetent. All of it pressed on me with suffocating force. But beneath it, there was also a clarity that had been missing from my life for years. They thought I was weak, but I was still here, still thinking, still planning. The bus would take me home, and once home, I would no longer play the role they had assigned me. The journey across the country was a kind of purgatory. The bus jolted and rattled through towns and cities, stopping in places I barely noticed, the hours blending into each other as I dozed in uncomfortable seats and ate sandwiches from vending machines. My body ached, my eyes burned, but my mind stayed awake, circling the same questions over and over. When had Beatrice decided that I was no longer her father, but her obstacle? Was it after Lavinia died, when she saw the insurance money and the savings, and realized what could be taken? Was it when she married Thornton, who looked at me as though I were a stubborn problem to be engineered away? Or had it been earlier, in some quiet way, a seed of resentment growing while I thought I was giving her everything she needed? These questions cut deeper than any physical pain, because they forced me to accept that the daughter I thought I had raised with love and sacrifice had chosen calculation over loyalty, manipulation over memory, greed over blood. The bus rolled on, and with every mile I told myself that the man who stepped off it in Fargo would not be the same man who had boarded in Portland. That man had been naive, willing to sign papers without reading, willing to buy love with checks. The man stepping off would be someone else, someone who understood that survival meant fighting with the tools of the world, documents, signatures, laws. When I finally arrived in Fargo 3 days later, my body felt like it had aged another decade, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I took a cab home, used the last of my cash, and when I stepped into my house, the air smelled of dust and disuse, as though even the walls had given up on me while I was gone. The answering machine blinked with 17 messages, Beatrice's voice ranging from casual concern to panicked pleading, and I sat listening to them in silence. Each message was a performance, a script written not for me, but for anyone who might later hear them, carefully crafted to suggest that she was a worried daughter and I was a confused old man who had wandered away. But I knew the truth, and the truth was that they had abandoned me, stolen from me, and expected me never to return. Sitting there in that dim kitchen with the blinking light of the answering machine, casting faint shadows on the wall, I realized the midpoint of this story was not simply that I had escaped their trap. The true midpoint was that I had crossed from being a man waiting for his daughter's love to being a man ready to strip her of the power she thought she had over him. I had been erased, but in the erasure I had discovered the outline of another version of myself, one who would not forgive, one who would not forget, one who would make sure that when the reckoning came, it would be recorded not as the senility of an old man, but as the justice of a father who had nothing left to lose. The first days back in Fargo were a blur of exhaustion and determination, my body barely able to keep pace with the demands my mind placed upon it. But I knew that if I allowed myself to rest too long, the momentum of survival would vanish, and my daughter's narrative would close in around me like a trap snapping shut. I moved quickly, driven by something deeper than fear, something closer to a final burst of pride that refused to let me leave the world on someone else's terms. My first stop was the bank, the familiar brick building where the tellers had known me for decades, where my deposits and withdrawals had always been routine, and where I now walked in with a face that must have betrayed how close I had come to being stripped of everything. Eleanor, the branch manager, recognized me at once and rushed to greet me, surprise written across her features. "Mr. Hollis," she said, "we've been trying to reach you. Your daughter was here yesterday, reporting that your credit card had been lost." I stood still for a moment, letting the words wash over me, and then answered as calmly as I could that the card had not been lost, but taken without my knowledge, and that I needed it blocked immediately. She hesitated, perhaps out of shock, perhaps because the story she had been given by Beatrice was so different, but she complied, and within minutes we were staring at the record of recent transactions. There it was, $5,000 withdrawn from an ATM in Portland 3 days earlier, and more chilling still, an attempted transfer of $20,000 to Beatrice's personal account, declined only because it exceeded the daily limit. My heart sank, not because of the numbers, I had more than enough to survive, but because the evidence was irrefutable, written in the language of money I had spoken my entire life. My daughter had not only tried to erase me, she had tried to strip me bare financially, and she had done it brazenly, convinced that I would never return to see the proof. I left the bank with a new card on the way, my accounts secured, and a sense of grim satisfaction that at least one door had been closed to her. But I knew money was only one part of the story, and that the deeper betrayal lay in the house I would help purchase. The house I had been promised was partly mine, the house into which I had never been welcomed. For months it had stood in my mind as a symbol of exclusion, a fortress I had paid to build but could never enter. And now I needed to know exactly what the papers I had signed in my grief had given me. I made my way to Martin Field, the lawyer who had helped me with Lavenia's estate, a man of quiet competence whose office overlooked the city park. He greeted me warmly, but with concern, remarking that I looked tired, and I told him the story in careful detail. The trip to Maine, the abandonment, the theft, the suspicion of a plot to declare me incompetent. He shook his head in disbelief, but promised to pull the relevant file. When he found it, flipping through the pages with the practiced fingers of a man who has seen too many secrets exposed by ink, his eyes lit with a kind of professional recognition. "Oberon," he said, "according to this deed, you are not just a co-borrower on the mortgage. You are a co-owner, equal shares. 1/3 of the house alongside Beatrice and Thornton." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "So I own part of that house?" I asked slowly. "Yes," he confirmed, "and not only that, but any decision regarding the sale or transfer of the property must be made unanimously. That gives you enormous leverage." The realization spread through me like warmth on a winter morning. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt the balance shift, not entirely in my favor, but enough to stand without bowing. Martin explained my options. I could sell my share, though buyers for such an arrangement were rare, or I could initiate a process to sell the entire property, forcing the others to respond. It might take time, it might even end in court, but the law was clear. I had rights they had not anticipated. I sat back in the chair, remembering the smug way Thornton had looked at me across the signing table, the way Beatrice had leaned on my grief to hurry my signature, and I felt the slow burn of justice begin to rise. "Let's initiate the process," I said, "and let's do it properly." Martin nodded, promising to draft the necessary documents, and handed me the contact of a realtor, a woman named Veronica Page, known for her tenacity. When I left his office, the air outside seemed sharper, the park greener, as though the world had tilted back slightly toward fairness. That was only the beginning. When I returned home, I looked around at my garage and saw Thornton's unused SUV sitting there, collecting dust like a forgotten relic. I remembered signing the registration papers when he insisted there were tax benefits to having my name included. And for the first time, I understood that what had seemed like a harmless gesture had actually given me leverage. The car had been parked on my property for over a year, unmoved, unacknowledged, and Martin had told me that under state law it could be claimed as abandoned property. I filed the necessary paperwork at the DMV, each form filled with meticulous care, and walked out knowing that in 30 days I might be able to sell the car legally. It was not revenge in the dramatic sense of the word, not violence or shouting, but it was a reclamation of power, a way of asserting that I was not disposable, that I could still act decisively. It felt almost medicinal, like setting a broken bone. My next step was the joint bank account Beatrice and I had kept since her college years, a relic of better times when I had sent her money for tuition and living expenses. For years I had continued to deposit $500 each month, a habit more than a necessity, and she had withdrawn it without acknowledgement, without gratitude, as though it were her right rather than my gift. I asked Eleanor at the bank to pull the records, and to my surprise the account still held over $27,000, money she had neglected to take in recent months. Every deposit had come from me, not a cent from her, and with Eleanor's cautious assistance I closed the account and transferred the funds into my personal one. Signing the final form, I felt a weight lift, as though another thread binding me to her had been cut. It was not the money itself, though it was substantial, but the act of reclaiming it, of declaring that my generosity would no longer be assumed as an endless well. In the weeks that followed, I set about remaking my life. I found a small apartment across town, modest but filled with light, overlooking a lake where the sunsets bled gold across the water. I moved only the essentials: clothes, a few books, photographs of Lavinia, my computer. Everything else I left behind in the old house, because it was filled with memories that had become as heavy as stones. I changed my phone number, my email, even the service providers I used, creating a new identity not to escape the law, but to escape my daughter's grasp. Each step was deliberate, careful, like a man walking backward out of a burning building. And with each step, I felt a strange freedom, a sense that for the first time in years, my life belonged to me alone, not to the demands and manipulations of others. Yet even as I built this new existence, the escalation from their side continued. Veronica, the realtor, inspected the Maplewood property and confirmed its high value, estimating it at around $700,000. She prepared the documents to initiate a sale, and official notices were sent to Beatrice and Thornton. Their silence stretched on for weeks, and I almost believed they would ignore it completely. Until one day Veronica called with a voice tight with controlled anger. "They've responded," she said, "but not as you might have hoped. They're claiming you are legally incapacitated, providing supposed medical documents alleging early dementia." I sat down heavily, my hand gripping the phone, as though it were the only anchor left. "That's a lie," I said. "I've had no such diagnosis, no such tests." "I know," Veronica replied, "and we will contest it. You'll need to undergo independent examinations, but I'm confident the truth will stand." Her words steadied me, but inside I felt the tremor of another betrayal. Not content with stealing my money, not content with abandoning me, my own daughter was now attempting to destroy my competence on paper, to erase me legally, to make of me a puppet whose strings she could pull at will. It was then that the second escalation became clear to me. The first had been their attempt to humiliate and abandon me in Maine, to render me invisible by isolating me. The second was this: the full-scale assault on my identity, the attempt to rewrite me as a man incapable of decision, a ward of their guardianship. It was no longer about dinners where I was mocked or trips where I was excluded. It was about courtrooms, signatures, and the possibility of being declared legally dead in everything but heartbeat. The scale of their ambition was staggering, and the cruelty of it nearly broke me, but at the same time, it gave me clarity. If this was the battlefield, then I knew where to stand. I agreed to every examination, sat with neurologists and psychiatrists and gerontologists, answering their questions with calm precision, reciting dates and details, demonstrating not only that I was competent, but that I remembered in painful clarity every humiliation, every theft, every lie. Their reports, unanimous, declared me sound of mind, and when I read the words in black ink, I felt a surge of vindication so strong I nearly wept. Yet even with those victories, the cost of escalation was heavy. Beatrice began leaving frantic messages, alternating between pleading for reconciliation and raging accusations that I had betrayed her, that I had ruined her life. Thornton, more measured but no less venomous, sent word through lawyers that I would regret dragging family matters into the public eye. I listened to none of it, answered none of it, because I understood now that every word from them was part of the same campaign, every syllable a weapon designed to break me down. Instead, I sat by the lake in the evenings, watching the sun sink low, and told myself that the true escalation was not theirs, but mine. The escalation of a man who had finally decided that love without respect was not love at all, that family without loyalty was a costume worn by strangers, that dignity, once taken, must be seized back with both hands. The war had entered its second act, and though I was weary, I was no longer afraid. The day of the confrontation arrived without warning, as though fate had decided I had prepared enough, and it was time to face the storm directly. For weeks the conflict had simmered in documents and letters, in real estate filings and medical reports, in quiet exchanges with lawyers who reassured me that truth was on my side. But battles waged on paper are only half the war. The other half is waged in voices, in looks across a table, in the trembling hands of people who once knew each other's hearts. I had avoided them since my return from Maine, and in truth, I had hoped to never see them again, except through signatures and rulings. But one afternoon Veronica insisted that I meet them, that we sit together in a public place with a mediator present, that we try one last time before the sale of the house was pushed into the courts. I agreed not out of hope for reconciliation, but because I knew that if there was to be a final severing, it should happen face to face, with words spoken aloud rather than only written in legal filings. We met in a cafe downtown, a neutral space chosen precisely because it was filled with witnesses, a place where rage would have to wear a mask of civility. I arrived early, as I always did, sitting at a corner table where the afternoon light fell through the windows, my documents folded neatly in a briefcase by my side. When they entered, I felt the air shift, as though a sudden draft had swept the room. Thornton carried himself with that casual arrogance I had come to know too well, scanning the cafe as if calculating its value, while Beatrice followed, her face set in a mask of determination that could not hide the nervous flicker in her eyes. They saw me, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then approached with the measured steps of people entering a battlefield they had once believed was theirs alone. I rose, not out of courtesy, but to remind myself that I could still stand tall, and gestured for them to sit. They did, Thornton crossing his arms, Beatrice folding her hands tightly on the table. The mediator, a woman whose calm voice seemed designed to withstand hurricanes, opened with pleasantries and reminded us of the purpose of the meeting, to discuss the status of the Maplewood property and to consider paths forward. But within minutes the civility collapsed, as though the thin veil of politeness could no longer contain the truth of what sat between us. Thornton leaned forward, his voice low but sharp, accusing me of betrayal, of dragging private matters into public view, of humiliating his family. I listened without speaking, my eyes fixed on his mouth as he spewed words that were meant to wound. And when he paused for breath, I opened my briefcase and laid the deed on the table, the one that bore my name beside theirs, the one that declared I was no interloper but an equal owner. The paper lay between us like a blade, its presence undeniable, and the silence that followed was the silence of recognition. Beatrice looked at it, then at me, and for the first time I saw not anger in her face, but fear. It was then that the conversation shifted from property to something far deeper. Beatrice accused me of being vindictive, of seeking to destroy her life out of spite, of turning against my own daughter. Her words poured out in a torrent, half rehearsed, half desperate, and at one point her voice rose so high that heads turned at nearby tables. "You were never there for me," she cried. "You only ever cared about your money, your rules, your control. Mom understood me, but you never did. You think this house matters, but it's not about a house. It's about you always needing to own everything, even me." Her words struck with a force I had not expected, not because they were true, but because in them I heard the echo of a wound I had never known she carried. For a moment I saw the little girl she had once been, fragile and uncertain, searching for love, and I almost faltered. But then I remembered Maine, the sandwiches in the refrigerator, the missing passport, the stolen card, the lies whispered into the ears of lawyers and bankers, and the softness in me hardened again. I leaned forward and spoke with a calm I barely felt, telling her that love was not ownership, that money had been given not to control, but to support, that the only control I'd ever wanted was the control to decide my own life without being erased by those who should have protected me. Thornton laughed, a short, contemptuous sound, and muttered that the courts would never believe me, that the story of an old man losing his mind was more convincing than whatever narrative I could spin. His arrogance was his mistake. I reached into the briefcase again and laid down the medical reports, one after another, each signed by professionals, each declaring me fully competent. The sound of the papers hitting the table was louder than any shout, and for a moment the entire cafe seemed to still. Thornton's smirk faltered, and Beatrice's hands began to tremble. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse or insult. I only said, "You tried to erase me, but I am still here. You tried to make me disappear, but the truth is written in black and white. You have taken enough from me. From this day forward, you take nothing more." The mediator, sensing the weight of the moment, intervened, reminding us that this was about the house, that decisions had to be made. But by then the real confrontation was no longer about bricks or mortgages. It was about whether I would remain a man in my own right, or whether I would become the puppet they had planned. And in that cafe, with the documents laid bare between us, I reclaimed myself. Beatrice wept quietly, her tears not of reconciliation, but of frustration, as though the collapse of her plan had stripped her of all defenses. Thornton stared at me with barely concealed hatred, but he could not speak, because the evidence had sealed his mouth. I gathered the papers calmly, placed them back into the briefcase, and rose. "The sale will proceed," I said simply. "And when it does, my share will be mine. This is not vengeance. This is justice." And with that, I left them sitting at the table, the cafe buzzing again around them, strangers watching as a father walked away from his daughter, not in defeat, but in reclamation. That was the climax. Not a shouted battle, not fists or threats, but the quiet assertion of truth in the face of lies. It was the moment when the scales tipped, when the years of humiliation and dismissal and betrayal were finally answered not with violence, but with the simple, undeniable weight of documents and dignity. For all their schemes, for all their manipulation, they could not erase me, because I refused to erase myself. The weeks that followed our confrontation in the cafe moved with a strange mixture of slowness and finality, as though the world itself understood that something long festering had been cut open and was now finally healing, though not without scars. Veronica handled the sale of the Maplewood house with relentless precision, filing every motion, answering every challenge, and guiding the process through a legal maze that Beatrice and Thornton tried desperately to complicate. They hired new lawyers, produced new stories, even attempted one last time to suggest that I had been manipulated by outside influences. But the evidence stood firm. My competence had already been established by multiple independent specialists, and no amount of their invention could erase the black ink of the deed that bore my name. In the end, the house was sold, and when the proceeds were divided, I received $233,000, a number that did not merely represent money, but the tangible proof that I had not been erased, that my signature and my standing in this world still held power. I used a portion of it to settle comfortably into the new apartment by the lake, a place filled with quiet and light, where no one's footsteps echoed except mine, and where the view each evening reminded me that beauty did not vanish simply because family bonds had rotted. I bought a new chair, a solid oak table, and allowed myself small luxuries I had denied for years. Not out of greed, but out of a quiet reclaiming of what it meant to live for myself. The rest I placed in careful accounts, managed with the same meticulous attention that had carried me through decades of work. And I did it not to build anything for others, but to preserve the dignity of choice for myself. For the first time since Lavinia died, I felt not like a remnant drifting at the edges of other people's lives, but like a man with ground beneath his feet and a future, however short, that belonged to him alone. The calls from Beatrice continued for a time, alternating between anger and pleading, each voicemail filled with a different tone, as though she were testing which voice might break through. In some, she begged for forgiveness, reminding me of birthdays and childhood memories, as though naming them could resurrect their meaning. In others, she shouted accusations, insisting I had betrayed her, that I had chosen strangers over blood, that I had destroyed her family. I listened to a few at first, then none at all, because I realized that every word she spoke was still written from the same script, the script where I was the obstacle to be managed, the wallet to be emptied, the man to be diminished. I had stepped out of that role, and the silence of not answering became a greater freedom than I had ever expected. Thornton never called directly, but I could hear his hand in the legal language that still arrived in the envelopes for a while, threats of countersuits and demands for compensation, all of which dissolved in the face of the truth and were eventually abandoned. The silence that followed was not the silence of neglect, as it had been before, but the silence of separation, final and irrevocable, and in that silence I found peace. Sometimes, in the evenings, I think of Lavinia and what she would have said had she lived to see this. I imagine her disappointment, her sorrow, but also her quiet strength. The way she would have told me that survival is not always about holding a family together, but sometimes about letting go of what poisons you. I remember her once writing in a letter that Beatrice had inherited my stubbornness, but not my patience. And perhaps that was truer than either of us realized. I do not know if my daughter will ever find her way back to a place where her heart is not ruled by calculation, and in truth it no longer matters to me. I gave her every chance. I gave her more than she deserved. And when she tried to take the last of me, I discovered that there are limits even to a father's love. It is not hatred that I carry now, but something quieter, a recognition that blood alone does not bind, and that loyalty must be earned no less by children than by parents. The days now pass in a rhythm that is simple but deeply my own. I walk by the lake each morning, watching the ducks cut across the water, their ripples fading as quickly as they form, and I feel a strange kinship with their quiet persistence. I read again long novels that had gathered dust on shelves, letting their words remind me that lives have always been filled with betrayal and redemption, that I am not the first old man to discover the cruelty of those he loved. And sometimes, when the evening light falls across the water and the air cools, I allow myself to imagine what remains of my legacy. It is no longer about houses or bank accounts or the inheritance that once seemed destined for my daughter's hands. It is about the dignity of not being erased, the stubborn fact that I remained myself even when others tried to write me into a role I refused to play. If there is any lesson in this, it is that survival sometimes looks less like victory and more like standing, quietly but firmly, in the truth of who you are. When neighbors ask after Beatrice, I say little. I do not slander her, nor do I defend her. I only say that we are no longer in contact, and leave it at that, because the story is too heavy to place on casual listeners. but in the privacy of my mind. When I replay the years of distance and the sharpness of that cafe confrontation, I feel not bitterness, but closure. The arc is complete. The man who once sat in his kitchen waiting for calls that never came, who once believed that checks could buy belonging, is gone. In his place is someone older, lonelier perhaps, but also freer. The silence in my apartment is no longer the silence of abandonment. It is the silence of peace.